I don't shy away from whole dairy fat, and specifically, I'm just a cheese lover. So Sardinians also have cheese that is particularly high in C15, in part because they're from sheep and goats that graze on mountainous grass. And all those combinations have shown that grass-eating ruminants at high altitudes produce the highest C15 in products there are. So they have this added benefit. So I do have cheese as a snack every day. That for sure helps boost my C15 levels along with the supplementation. So that, I think, is the combination of those two that gets me at this good targeted C15 level.
Let's get more into the food piece and talk about nuances there, because you're already starting to bring those in with the sheep and the goat, the fact that altitude matters. Let's bring in all the different variables when it comes to dairy, because this is our best source. And there are so many different pieces to this. And let's really take our time and go through it. There's the A1 versus A2 when it comes to cow. There's pasteurization, homogenization. Let's go right from the top and do a broad overview, and then we can get into some details.
That sounds good. So dairy fat is our primary source. And the first question I always get is like, okay, so if we created C15 deficiencies because we took dairy fat, we've been reducing our dairy fat intake over the past 40 to 60 years, we'll just go back to drinking milk, whole fat milk and eating whole fat cheese. And it's part of the solution. And I do fully believe that we need to get our kids back to having whole dairy fat for those kids that can tolerate it. Because in the 1990s, the pediatric recommendations changed. And it used to be where the recommendations since 1977 were for all Americans to decrease their intake of saturated fats. The primary way to do that is by eating less butter and drinking less whole fat milk. So then in the 1990s, the recommendations went even further for kids, where the recommendations were saying that children, really young children, should avoid or should move off of whole fat milk after they turn the age of 2. And then for babies that are age 1, if they are at risk of fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes, they're actually told to go off of whole fat milk by 1. So part of this, so as far as food and fixing the problem, I do think that food can help fix some of the deficiency issues at the earliest ages. When we start looking at us as adults, there are advantages of getting C15 from our diet, but there also becomes kind of a balance and challenge. And that is because if we look at milk fat, only 1% of milk fat has C15. Only 1% of milk fat is C15. Over 40% of milk fat are these pro-inflammatory, even chain saturated fatty acids. So C15 can do its job, but if you can imagine, it's like being in a room with a bunch of bullies and it's having to compete with pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory activities, which makes it harder to do its heavy lifting if we talk about the back half of maybe from the age 30 on. And so the reason why the Navy funded us to develop this supplement, this pure C15 supplement, is to say, can we get this pure ingredient that's bioavailable absent of the competing pro-inflammatory fats? And so there was a group that actually did a study, Jess, where they looked at a model of type 2 diabetes in mice, and we had given it pure C15. They gave it pure C17 and dairy fat. And what they showed was that we showed that C15, they got better. C17 was kind of meh. And when they gave the mice dairy fat, they got worse. So there's a complicated picture if we talk about what we're going to do over a long time. That said, I shared that I eat dairy fat. So when we talk about how we influence it in the food chain, a few key important points. The first is, like I mentioned, grass versus corn-fed. So animals that are fed grass have twice as much C15 in their fat than ones that are 100% corn-fed. We don't always know what's been fed when we're eating dairy products. So we don't actually know anymore how much C15 is in the milk that we're eating. One thing that we're encouraging as part of this movement is having dairy producers report how much C15 is in their product, because I personally will choose the product that has more C15 in it. That's another way that we could help fix this problem. We also know that when we had talked about the mountainous grass, it doesn't appear that there's a difference based upon homogenization, surprisingly, or species. So if it's a goat, if it's a sheep or cow, it doesn't seem to matter. What's more important is what their diet is that dictates the C15 in their dairy fat. I've just been going on forever, so I'm going to pause.
No, this is great. This is what I wanted you to do. Thank you. The piece that I'm puzzled on, and you alluded to it quickly there as well, is the homogenization, where we're emulsifying the fat. So we're chemically changing things, and C15 is a saturated fat. So that one I'm perplexed on.
I am too. And I thought for sure we're going to see, like, if you look at homogenization, pasteurization versus raw milk is going to have more C15 in it and result in higher C15. And that there was a group that actually looked specifically at that. And I surprisingly saw there was no difference between the two. So it might have to do with the stability of C15. It's a very stable molecule, and it could just be that it is just able to better withstand the challenges of homogenization and pasteurization.
Okay, so dairy's our top food. We know the dolphins were getting it from fatty fish. So let's talk about that as a food source. Different types of fish, how much we can actually get from fish, and then we'll get into other foods.
Sounds great. So for fish, there is C15 in fish, different types of fish. So for example, for the fish that we most often eat, salmon is probably the fish that has the highest amount of C15. So that's good news, because I eat fish probably once a day. So big fish eater. So that might be another reason why my C15 levels are high. However, there is a caveat in which C15 is highest in the skin and the heads of the fish, which tends to be the parts of the fish that we don't eat, unless you eat anchovies, which you can end up eating the whole fish. So that's wild fish can provide some C15 compared to dairy fat, like studies that have looked at populations, fish intake, and their C15 levels. There's not a strong correlation. Versus when you say how much dairy fat does a person eat and what are their C15 levels, it's almost a perfect correlation if it was whole fat milk, for example.
When it comes to food or supplements, how long does it stay in the system? Is this something we need to have on a daily basis, weekly? Do we have some kind of reservoir where we can take days off of taking it in?
The answer is yes, but not for too long. And I'm not saying that because we sell supplements. So the studies have shown that we have two ways that we're using C15. So the first is where when we absorb C15, it goes into our blood, and then it activates certain receptors, things like PPAR alpha delta. We talked about AMPK and AKT, which help with regard to the first with metabolism, controlling inflammation, the second being helping with insulin control and insulin and glucose control. So those go up and then they go down. And so their half-life to trigger those receptors ends up being about 4 to 6 hours a day. So that comes and goes. So having ongoing exposure to C15 helps with activating those receptors. But then there's a longer term play, which is the one that we've been focusing on, which is C15 goes into our cell membranes. And it clearly doesn't just wash away after a few hours. Once it makes its way into our cell membranes, it'll stay there unless we dramatically change the fat in our diet. And amazingly, Jess, one study showed that in as early as 2 days, if you have an extreme shift, if you went from a very high fat diet to a very low fat diet, within 2 days, the makeup of our cell membranes and fatty acids reflects that change in your diet. So it can happen quite rapidly, but there are reserves, and it does go into our fat. It does get into our tissues, not just to our circulating red blood cells. So I would say non-scientifically, not pointing to any peer-reviewed study, which everything else I've said today points to a peer-reviewed study, that, probably a week to 2 weeks before your cells and body would start feeling a decrease in that effects of the C15.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
One of the most important things that C15 does is it serves as an armor that helps to stabilize our cell membranes. Really important because it prevents them from breaking down, which is a primary cause of aging.